Okay, so before we look at finding the least common denominator between two fractions, we should probably define what the least common denominator is. So we typically call the least common denominator LCD for short. And what it is, it's the smallest expression that contains all the factors of both denominators. Okay, so let's sort of see some examples of what I mean by this. So the least common denominator between 7/12 and 4/5 is 60, because 60 is the smallest number that contains 12 and 5 as factors. Another way to look at this is you can think about 12 as having factors of 2 squared times 3. If you were to write the prime factors of this, right, 2 and 3 are both prime, 5 is prime, so you also need a 5 in there, and 2 squared times 3 times 5 is also 60. But typically we don't need to worry about looking at the prime factorization. We just need to come up with a number that contains both of these numbers as factors and is the smallest number that does such. So in the first example, the least common denominator happened to be 12 times 5. In the second example, 12 times 18 will be a common denominator, but it's not the smallest. The smallest common denominator here is 36. Okay, so another way you could do this is to think about, okay, well, 18 is the bigger number. Does 12 go into 18? And it does not. So then you say, okay, let's go to the next multiple of 18, which is 36. 18 goes into 36 and 12 goes into 36, so that has to be the least common denominator. So that's how to do this with numbers. In this case, the LCD definitely has to contain the x plus 1, right? Because it has to contain every factor here, and the only factor is x plus 1 in this first fraction. But then you look at the second fraction, and it has to also contain x plus 1 squared. So all we do is we sort of build on what we already have. Now, x plus 1 is a factor of this, and x plus 1 squared is clearly a factor of this because they're exactly the same. So this is the LCD in this case. The LCD in this case is a little more complex. Let's start with, it's got to contain both of the factors here, so let's start by writing those, x plus 1 times x minus 3. And then we have to contain all the factors here. Well, we already have the x plus 1, but we don't have, see, our x plus 1 is to the first power, but we need to have x plus 1 cubed. So I'm simply going to make this x plus 1 cubed, because that still contains the x plus 1, but now it also contains the x plus 1 cubed. And then the x minus 3 contains this x minus 3, and now we also have to contain x minus 4, which we don't have, so I'll just attach that on to the end. So that is the least common denominator in this case. Alright, so by now you should be realizing that the numerator doesn't affect the common denominator, so I just put question marks to emphasize that here. In this example, let's go through and identify the factors in each denominator. 6 is a factor, 2x plus 3 and x minus 1 are the factors here. In the second one, you have 8 times x minus 2. This x is not tied to the 8 whatsoever, so we have 3 factors in this case as well. The LCD needs to contain all of these factors. So what I like to do is, since now we have numbers that are factors, I like to find the least common denominator between those first. In this case, the smallest number that 6 and 8 both go into is 24. So I've taken care of the 6 and the 8 in my least common denominator. I've contained both of those. Now I need to contain the 2x plus 3, the x minus 1, the x and the x minus 2. Typically the x comes first, so I'm going to put 24x. Sorry, that should be red. 24x, and then I'll write my 2x plus 3, then my x minus 1, and then my x minus 2. And now I've contained every factor in the denominators. Okay, so we've missed out on one important thing. We have to factor the denominators first. Notice all these denominators are factored. You have to factor them first, and then you can sort of build your LCD to contain all of the factors. So I didn't do that, but all you have to do is factor your denominators before you start building the least common denominator.